This week's episode is sponsored by Samsung.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Derek Fassbender.
Welcome, listeners. I'm Derek Fassbender, host of the B&H Photography Podcast.
And I'm Jill Waterman, the podcast senior creative producer.
And I'm Mike Weinstein, the show's technical producer and audio engineer.
In the realm of contemporary landscape photography, few artists have pushed the boundaries of perception as boldly as John Paul Caponigro and Joel Simpson. While their approaches differ, both photographers share a profound commitment to revealing the extraordinary within seemingly ordinary scenes. In today's show, we're bringing these visionary artists together for a chat that explores the philosophical foundations of their work, their technical innovations, and their shared commitment to transforming how we see and relate to the natural world. In an era of environmental challenges and blurred realities, their dialogue offers insights into the power of photography to tell stories beyond what the eye can see and offer insights into questions that haven't yet been asked. But before we immerse ourselves, here's some additional background about each of our guests. John Paul Caponigro is a digital media pioneer, combining his painting background with a variety of photographic processes using the latest in digital technology. His work is about the perception of nature and the nature of perception. Widely respected as an authority on creativity, photography, and fine art printing, John Paul's images and writings are widely published in periodicals and books, and he's been a contributing editor to a variety of magazines and websites. He's also author of the video training series Revolution and the book Adobe Photoshop Masterclass, now in its second edition. As a highly sought-after speaker and educator, John Paul has presented lectures and workshops around the globe. His art has been exhibited internationally, and his prints are housed in numerous public and private collections. Select clients include Adobe, Apple, Canon, Kodak, and Sony, and he is a member of the Photoshop Hall of Fame, Epson's Stylus Pros, and X-Rite's Colorati. Joel Simpson began making pictures as a teen in the 1960s, turning pro in 2002. Since that time, he's had more than 50 exhibitions in the U.S. and abroad. His work has also been widely published and received numerous awards, including a Nautilus Gold Award for Art and Photography for his 2019 book, Earth Forms, Intimate Portraits of Our Planet. His new book, Faces in the Rocks, Beyond Landscape to Psychogeological Photography, organizes his discoveries about the aesthetics of abstract and figurative forms in the earth, concluding with a tongue-in-cheek collection of imagined extraterrestrial landscapes and future cityscapes. In addition to his career in photography, Simpson holds a PhD in comparative literature and spent 22 years as a professional jazz pianist. He lives in Union, New Jersey. John Paul Caponigro and Joel Simpson, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Derek.
Thank you. Delightful to be here.
Pleasure to have you both on. Now, Joel, you first picked up a camera in the 60s, so if my math is correct, you've been doing this photography thing for about 60 years. I want to know, what types of subject matter did you first focus on when you picked up a camera, and have you always been drawn to the landscapes and geological forms?
Well, the answer is yes. My first camera was a fixed lens Calamar A camera that my uncle bought me. It was a 35 millimeter camera. But my father bought a new Rambler, and we drove out to California from New Jersey. And I had this camera and was armed with Kodachrome 1, ISO 10, and a tripod that fell off the top of the car as we motored through Pennsylvania. And I came home with pictures of the Grand Canyon and sites out west, the deserts of Arizona and the Golden Gate Bridge. And what I like to do was project them onto a bed sheet strung across a doorway so that I can imagine I was out there again. So for me, landscapes were a means of re-experiencing being elsewhere. Then I got a better camera, Topcon, and went into New York and did social documentary. And some of those photographs from the 60s are still very interesting.
So it was almost like this childlike sense of discovery and transporting yourself somewhere else was always prevalent in your photography, even from an early age.
Absolutely, yeah. And landscapes has a sense of place, which is what I believe to be the nature of landscapes.
Mm-hmm. Were you seeing form at that point? Was it really just the magnitude of the landscapes, the beauty, the colors, the way the shadow and the light played, or what was it for you at that age?
Well, first of all, I was 13, 14 years old, so I understood about composition. And the owner of one of the two photography shops in Union, we no longer have any, complimented me on my compositions when I was about 14 or 15. So I did have a sense of composition. And I was looking at a lot of photographs. I love to look at photographs, which is what I recommend to everybody.
And now your current photography is more about seeing things that haven't been seen before. When did you start to go down that path? At what age? Or was there kind of a defining moment where you started to take that route?
Well, I fell in love with geological photography. And in fact, the Earth Forms book is really about geologically oriented landscapes. So I've always been looking for exceptional geology. And a trip out west educates anyone who goes into the wilderness and sees deserts to the fact that this country has some amazing sites, some unique sites in the world. So I fell in love with that. And then I started closing in on short form, close compositions, which I called eventually geoframing, and kept seeing things. I saw abstract compositions, and then I started to see figurations. And I wondered if anyone else saw them, if this was valid. I studied the work of Aaron Siskind in particular, who, toward the end of his life, went to the big island of Hawaii and elaborately photographed the lava there. And I have done the same thing. But he wouldn't name the figures that seemed to pop up. He believed that it was important to let the viewer see what he or she saw. So I found things that were even more explicit, and I went to places that were hardly known at that time. And I wondered for a while, does anyone else see this? Is there any aesthetic value to this? Am I just going off in my own direction? And then during COVID, when I couldn't travel, I just gotten back from a winter trip out west because I wanted to see Bryce Canyon in the snow, and I bought myself a fisheye lens so I could make the equivalent of snow globes from images of Bryce Canyon surrounded by snow. When I got home, in February, March, I started working on editing some of the close-ups, essentially, of rock formations. And I realized that with the tools of the raw editor in Photoshop, I could make much more salient and visible the things that had touched me, because I'd taken these pictures out of an immediate, intuitive sense that there was something there. Sometimes it was figurative, sometimes it was abstract. Sometimes it was questionable abstract, which I eventually came to call liminal figuration. But then I read in Pepe Carmel's wonderful book on abstraction, a global history, that abstraction and figuration interpenetrate each other. And I think John Paul has made some very significant comments on this subject too. And I got a little more confident in these images. And so I created two more short books, 50, 60 pages, with my best photographs. And then I realized that I needed to organize it. I had actually read a book by the French photo critic Jean-Claude Lemagny, which was called Shadow something, and then he ended with fiction. So I thought, well, mine has to end in fiction too, but I'll call mine landscape, abstraction, figuration, fiction. And then after going through about 3 versions of this, I realized that this is much too heavy a title, so I shortened it to Faces in the Rocks. And then I went really far out on a limb and gave it a subtitle, Beyond Landscape to Psychogeological Photography. And I realized I was taking a risk because no one had ever heard of that, and I invented it. But then after writing the book several times, I believed I was onto something, and people seemed to agree with me. And I'll take objections, I'll debate it. But that's how I came to it.
So Joel, the word Pareidolia comes up a lot in your writing. There's a subreddit on reddit.com that's called Pareidolia.
Oh, really?
Dedicated to images, not geological necessarily.
Oh, of course not.
But images that people can see faces. So fire hydrants and all sorts of mechanical devices that seem to have faces in them. So the word and the concept is probably pretty popularized through the internet. And, I have noticed the forcefulness with which my brain sees faces in
Mm-hmm.
abstract forms. I think that's a byproduct of some evolutionary psychology there. Faces are really important for people.
That's absolutely true. Babies have to recognize faces in order to be safe.
Yeah, it's almost the most important thing that our brains
Mm-hmm.
sort of comprehend. Someone looking like they're going to hurt us or help us, or are they sick? So I guess the title is novel, or your conception of it, but perhaps the actual apprehension or the neurology behind this is quite common.
Well, let me just address this right at the outset because it's a problem. I went to a folio review last year in Arles, the rencontre that they have,
Mhm.
and most people were very impressed with my work, but there was this one French, I think he was a publisher, and he said, this is just Pareidolia. You dismissed it.
Mm.
And so I realized that Pareidolia is not taken seriously as fine art. It's a novelty. By the way, the word dates back to 1866 when a German psychiatrist identified it as a pathology because he was imagining that people who saw faces in rocks and clouds and so on were a throwback to our ancestors who saw spirits everywhere.
Mm.
So that if you believed this, you really weren't in the modern period. So the Faces in the Rocks book addresses this, and I show some examples of what's considered popular pareidolia. If you go to Cap de Creus, for example, where Dali hung out as a young man, there are figures in rocks on the top of the rock formations that are identified as particular animals by plaques with outlines in the plaques in iron, no words.
Mm.
And I give the example of the eagle, and there's the outline of the eagle and the iron plaque at your feet.
Yeah.
All right, so that's popular pareidolia. But I say, well, wait a second. But psychogeological photography actually draws from all the images that the photographer has seen in his or her lifetime. So it's a much wider range of images than those that fall into popular pareidolia, that everyone can agree that, oh, there's a dinosaur, there's a wolf, there's a man on the moon. That's the first distinguishing characteristic, but it's based on our unconscious inventory of images that everybody has. Now, the wider, the broader, the deeper, the more numerous the images in your image bank, the more you'll see.
Yeah.
So since I've been fascinated by surrealist imagery, the imagination of surrealist painters, more than the surrealist photographers who were involved in different things, I'm seeing a much broader group of things out in reality. And in the book, if I may read you something from page 105, the second factor that distinguishes fine art pareidolia from the popular variety is the range of types of figures found. The 27 general figures that begin this collection include perverse, ironic, grotesque, monstrous, prophetic, the dead coral, satirical, and fairy tale. To these are added 3 imaginary fossils, 4 mythological creatures, 6 erotic figures, 5 figures in ice, and 2 at the end that use color in bizarre ways.
By the way, that's your personal index.
Yeah, right.
I think it might be a good time to loop John Paul into this conversation, since his work is very influenced by this concept as well. How does the term pareidolia function within your work, John Paul?
Yeah, it was really fun to hear Joel run with his relationship to it. And I think everyone needs to ask what's their relationship to it. It's hardwired into us. A couple of things that would be fun to include in this conversation is it's not limited to images. It's also found in things like sound, many other senses. So it's part of the human creature, and probably this extends to other species as well. It's hardwired into us to make sense out of chaos, to try and find patterns. And so we end up looking at the ways that we make patterns. To track back to, Joel had identified the coining of the term and some of the origins of where the psychologist Rorschach derived his test. Now, it's really interesting to talk to psychologists who will sometimes disclose that when somebody's giving a Rorschach test, they're not looking so much for what the person sees as the strategies that the person is using to solve this creative challenge. All of these skills and perspectives are useful for us to see the way that we're seeing. And I think part of what Joel is doing is a little bit of mind mapping It's a different way of entering into that and developing his personal relationship with the subjects and with his history. I suspect there's also something archetypal. So while I may or may not see Jesus in your grilled cheeses, I think we can find these Venn diagrams where we do overlap. And so this cuts down to ideas of intention and how clearly are we able to communicate an intention, and also how much room do we leave for the viewer. And I think these are two really critical questions. I like for there to be a there. I'd like somebody to get some skin in the game, even in the most abstract work. I'd like there to be a relationship that then I can kind of reach out to this other human soul. But I also appreciate work that leaves room for the viewer. So does Michael Kenna.
May I express my gratitude for that statement?
Yeah. What is it you're appreciating in there, Joel?
You say leave room for the viewer.
Yeah.
I am flattered when someone sees something in one of my photographs that I didn't see, because my long-term goal is to get people to look harder at what first appears to be chaos.
Right. You know, I'd love to tell a little story about Pareidolia, and one of my images. It was a seminal image for me, a kind of transition point to feel like I had found something that was my own, but it also invites the viewer in so many different ways. So it's this symmetrical cloud that I created in Photoshop. I found it by moving a mirror across my light table. I was working with transparencies at that time. I saw it out of the corner of my eye and said, wait, go back. That's better than what you're working on. I don't know what it is, but I have to chase it. And I was thrilled when I finished it. Years later, I was able to exhibit it in my open studio. I was lucky enough to be standing in the corner of the studio, and this little 4-year-old jumps across the threshold and stops in his track, goes, I said, success. Look, if you can catch the breath with that perpetual motion machine, success. And he starts waving his arms and he starts sputtering. I was never so glad for glass. I usually don't like the reflections. It took me a long time to make peace with the reflections. But in this case, the spit guard was very much appreciated for these early iris prints. And he exclaims, it's a giant sneeze. To this day, we call that image in the studio the giant sneeze. It's one of my fond stories. And I'm sitting there with my artistic intention in the corner of the room thinking, I titled the work Avra, which is the Sanskrit word for breath. Right. Breath, sneeze, close enough. Our Venn diagrams had overlapped. So over the years, I've had hundreds of stories with this one image, and I seek them out. I encourage people to share them. And I won't share what I see or the many things that I see and my evolving relationship to that, because they're changing the way that I see the image as well, and I'm changing, right? It keeps going. I had an initial impression, but it gets layered and richer. As Joel was saying, we have this large visual library, which Howard Schatz really celebrates developing, and Joel is saying we've got this layer of history and it just gets richer. And this is an opportunity to tune into that. So dancing cranes, goddesses, musical instruments, keeps going. A friend of mine bought this print, was thrilled with it, brought it back to his wife. Look, isn't it beautiful? Where should we hang it? You're not hanging that in here. Why not? Can't you see? It's dirty. What do you mean? It's an X-ray of somebody sitting on the toilet. I just have to say, keep going, keep going. Right. One gentleman came up during an exhibit and kind of reeking of scotch and smoke and said, I love your satanic icon. I'm looking around the room saying, where? And he leads me over to this image that the larger sense is some sense of the beatific and some sense of breath. The series I was working, the working title was Heaven's Breath. Okay. A certain amount of intention, certain amount of success there. But here, this guy was so far off the mean. I just had to bite my tongue, enjoy the story, watch the ride, because he had his relationship and I wasn't going to take that away from him.
Yeah.
Interesting. We're talking about Pareidolia and this idea of perception. And since the discussion of psychology has already entered the chat, I'm going to continue down that path with the concentration of Gestalt psychology, where it's not just the sum of its parts. It is something greater in thinking of these abstract geological images or psychogeological images. How does that idea of Gestalt psychology play into the perception and the composition and how we look at images?
Well, I think there are many ways to approach that. And reading Rudolf Arnheim is well worth the slog. One of the things I emphasize for my students, and I'm always aware of, is this Gestalt spectrum of interests. And as humans, we're self-interested. we tend towards anthropomorphism, to seeing things that remind us of the human form, faces trumping all, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mom, right? Lacking that, we start to reach out to other animals. And there's a little bit of distance, but they're generally warm and fuzzy enough until you get into lizards, and that might or might not be more challenging. But it's still a little more relatable than plants, which are still a little more relatable than rocks. And it's really hard to get people involved in rocks unless they're geologists or, gem hounds or something got them in. But they're kind of the exception to the rule. So when Joel and I are out there photographing the bare bones of the earth, we need to find ways to engage our audiences, find ways to bring them in and share our passion for it, but also realize we might be a little off the mean. We're probably interested in things that not everybody's interested in, and we need to find ways to connect with. So this Gestalt spectrum of interest, I think, is very useful as a communication tool, but also as a perspective to understand how we may be relating to our subjects as well.
Mm.
Could I inject a little point of clarification here?
Yeah.
I noticed in my work that there were certain images that were absolutely gobsmackingly unmistakable. And those I called figurations, simply enough. Then there were those that were clearly abstract, and then there were those that were somewhere in the middle. There are all kinds of images out there. The clear ones, the unmistakably figurative images, are rare, but they're there. And if you see enough rocks, you'll find them. I mean, the cover of my book is an extremely explicit old man's face, which is entirely natural. There's a place in New Mexico called Goblin Colony. It's not in any guidebook. I found it on the web. I went there, and there were no signs pointing to it. And it was a mile and a half of an old track that disappeared into the woods. And sure enough, there it was, these enormous rocks with lots of holes in them, and about 4 or 5 sets of holes turned into faces. So it was called Goblin Colony. But this is not on the tourist trek. So what I'm saying is that there's a continuum from total abstraction, including repeating patterns and dried mud, to absolutely clear, unmistakable figurative forms of many different natures, as I read from my list, and then everything in between. So let's not just assume that everything we see is ambiguous and subject to everyone's interpretation. Lots of things are, and I photograph those too, and they're in the book. But then there are some that are unmistakable. And I don't think Aaron Siskind ran into many of those.
Right.
No, seriously. I mean, where are the rocks that he photographed? Most of them were in the East, where he was. And then he went to Hawaii, and he found a few things. Of his 109 or so photographs in his collection called Volcano, which you can find a lot of examples of it on the web, but it's never been published in a book. Only 2 or 3 of them are clearly explicitly figurative.
Yeah.
The rest of them are very interesting abstractions.
Yeah, and I think his orientation was very different. I mean, you're looking for it. He's not. He's tracking 20th century abstraction.
He came out of the abstract expressionists.
Very much, yeah.
And he found that you could apply the same aesthetic to natural forms and to torn posters and to rust and to asphalt.
Right. And you see, that's one of the reasons I got in photography. The idea that we could use the very same tools, go to the very same places, and come away with such individual responses. It's a wonderful mirror. That Tsarkovsky fabulous exhibit brings one of the crucial questions in photography to light. Is the photograph a window onto the world, or is it also a mirror into the self? And I think Stephen Shore very deftly put it, that's a false dichotomy. It's both. And he likes to think of his photographs as they're 100% on the spectrum on both. Like, whether you agree with them or not, like that's an interesting perspective, interesting way of looking at it.
Absolutely.
I'd also like to add into the conversation here that I think these types of images contain multiple interpretations, and it's not an either or. Did you get the elephant? Yeah, okay, I got the elephant, and I got something else as well. Maybe 2 or 3 different things. And maybe one comes through more strongly than others, and maybe one is more archetypal, where pan-culturally people will relate to that, and maybe one is much more individual, where it's really just my trip, man. And it's useful to be able to sift that because it's a tool for self-awareness, for awakening, for discussion with other people, for building community.
Right. That's sort of maybe that we could say segue into a next topic, but I just want to touch on this idea that, Siskind and perhaps early Simpson were going into the natural landscape, not necessarily noticing or looking for forms or faces or countenances or anything, but at least in Simpson's part, discovering this stuff after the fact through a type of post-visualization, using the tools of digital imaging to bring out these things and saying, oh, wow, look at that. I'm wondering if we can just discuss the differences between what you get out of approaching a project pre-visualization and approaching one with a post-visualization, so which you go in sort of empty and discover the stuff later. Do you find that there's a difference in the resulting work from those two standpoints?
I think there's a huge difference because you're different.
Mm-hmm.
So many people will ask me, do you pre-visualize? Yes. Do you post-visualize? Yes. If they ever come across, do you pre-visualize or post-visualize? I say yes.
Uh-huh.
So the real question becomes, what happens when I'd love to tell you another little story here. It's something that was seminal for me. When I was 7, Dad was teaching at the Ansel Adams workshop. And Jerry Ellsman was also teaching that week. And they were having dinner and I was hanging on. And Dad and Ansel are trading tips about music. Ansel loved Mozart. Dad prefers Chopin. Jerry felt that his player piano sounded better if he didn't wear shoes or socks. So, sensing that the conversation wasn't inclusive enough or had kind of come to a coda, Dad starts to tease Ansel with one of his favorite lines. Ansel, if you can pre-visualize your images, you deserve what you got. Ansel seriously started backpedaling. Well, Paul, when I coined the term pre-visualization, I didn't mean I knew exactly what I was going to get. After all, I also coined the phrase, the negative is the score, and the print is the performance, the sense of discovery. And I'm looking at Jerry and I'm thinking, this conversation doesn't fit this guy. He's shooting fragments. He doesn't know if he's going to use it. If he does use it, he might use it multiple times and it could become totally separate things. And right on cue, as if he was a mind reader. Maybe he was looking at me. Maybe it was just appropriate for the conversation. He pipes up and says, wagging his finger at Ansel, you're the reason I came up with that mouthful post-visualization. Can't we just call it visualization? And I, to his point, yes, they are all different ways of visualizing. And in fact, I think there are many more than pre and post. And it would be useful to talk about these distinctions, about how you see the world differently when you approach your creative process one way and when you approach it another. But that is the most important thing for any listener to take away and for us to hold as we continue to evolve as artists. When we choose a certain route, we shape our experience. If we're conversant with many different ways of working, many different ways of being, a process is a relationship, is a way of being. If we're conversant with a variety, we have a greater choice. And we can, let's just say we can dance more skillfully with this experience we call life.
I've been through the process of trying to master 2 different arts, and one is jazz piano and the other is photography. And in the process of learning an art, there's an imitation phase. After you learn the mechanics, how to physically operate your tools, the best thing you can do is look to see what inspires you, what the masters have done, and try to approximate that as best you can. When you do that with landscape photography, you end up with good calendar pictures and postcards. And lots of landscapes that one sees on Instagram, for example, are simply variations on the same kind of theme, with skies and horizons and clouds and sunsets and so forth. And I went through a long phase like that. But of course, when you're out there, you're also going to find things that you've never seen before, especially if you go to places like Mono Lake or Fantasy Canyon. What happened to me was I started photographing things I had never seen before. I had no models for. And so I didn't know if anyone else thought they had any value. But then during the phase when I couldn't travel during COVID, and I worked on the editing, I brought out images that really struck me. that I was very moved by. And I decided to say, these have to be good, even though I've never seen anything like this before. And that developed into the whole philosophy of this book and the mission of this book. And the fact that I keep repeating, you're going to create images that neither you nor anyone else has ever seen before. They're not imitations. They are not pre-visualizations. They're collaborations between your unconscious and the apparent chaos of the rocks and ice formations.
Joel, was that like a demarcation point for you in terms of the imitation phase and
the originality?
Yeah, whatever you want to call that next phase? Or did that happen numerous times over your photographic journey?
Well, I mean, in terms of landscapes, I got pretty good at doing landscapes. But I also realized that there's so many fantastic landscapes. We're talking way beyond calendar and postcard. Instagram is full of breathtaking, amazing landscapes. But the field is so crowded. There's a question, well, how do you stand out? Where can you find some path to originality?
Right.
And what I discovered was, look at the rocks, let your unconscious be your guide to paraphrase Jiminy Cricket, and then learn the editing techniques that you'll need to bring it out and make it extremely salient. Whack the eye of the viewer, right?
I'd love to weigh in there real quick. I mean, I think what Joel is talking about here about trying things, about experimenting, about going out on a limb, about not censoring yourself. It's easy to kind of filter out, I'm supposed to make an image like
right.
Ansel Adams or whoever else your distant mentor might be. That is a phase. I have other stories to tell there. But I mean,
I remember going through it.
Yeah, right.
I remember having serious doubts about myself. Is anyone else going to like this?
Right. And so does, Emmett Gowan. Emmett Gowan said something to me years ago. It's just a wonderful phrase. He said, I had to do a lot of Robert Frank to find Emmett Gowan. Chuck Close apparently said he had to do a lot of de Kooning. And that really mystified me. Mr. Airbrush, Mr. Photo Realist had to do a lot of de Kooning. And then you look at the later works, you look at the little brush strokes in each little cell and you say, oh, now I get it. And you see him in a whole new light. So it is a little bit about like the scene in Robert Altman's The Player. They're all pitching new movies. Well, it's, kind of a combination between who are those two artists for you? And try and create some generative tension between the two. Because if you say Edward Weston and Ansel Adams, maybe it's not enough stretch. I know I'm on the right track when a reviewer says his work is a little bit like George O'Keeffe and Mark Rothko. Well, they're far enough apart that you got to try and reconcile this koan. And that's exactly what we have to do as artists, is reconcile the koan that we are. And those are only touchstones. I'd like to also just include a notion of authenticity as a counterpoint to originality. Westerners tend to emphasize thinking originality might be, it looks totally different than anything I've ever seen before. And in the East, they often look a little askance at that. They're looking for evolution within a tradition and what an individual's voice within that tradition brings to it. You might have 3-4 different master poets, Basho, Shiki, Isa, and they're all using the same form. They're all talking about nature. They're working in a fairly narrow range there, and yet their sensibility comes through in their poetry nonetheless. And that's what I would root in authenticity. So I'd be suspect of originality, just cautious, because just because it looks different, like the latest HDR filter, doesn't mean it's authentic. Now, the two might very well converge and it gets really exciting.
This is also why you have to be extremely stern with yourself and only show your best work. Because there's always the danger of preciousness, which is thinking that, if I did it and it's original and it must be interesting to everybody. It's not. You really have to have a very critical view of yourself and show it to other people. However, there's also the question of what are the producers going to think? And I'm reminded of the story of Dave Brubeck in 1960, who came up with Time Out, a whole record of non-4/4 time original tunes. And Columbia was very skeptical. They didn't want to produce it because nothing like that had ever been done before. Right? And so producers who are investing the money in a big production, luckily with photography, we don't have too many producers, although there are book publishers who will be very skeptical of something that comes along claiming originality. So they're looking for a variation on the last success, which will give them a higher percentage possibility of making money on it because they
Right.
lose
Yeah.
money on most of their products. And then Time Out came out in 1960, and the rest is history. It was one of the best-selling albums ever because it was so beautiful.
But I would say that one of the benefits of a modern day platform like Instagram for visual stuff is that the gatekeeping is effectively removed at that point.
That's right. You can try it out.
And so you can, try it out with a worldwide audience.
Yeah, and be careful about the advice you get because, again, you don't want to censor yourself. You don't want to be your own gatekeeper just because somebody else is looking askance. I'm reminded of Sam Elliott sitting in a late-night talk show interview, and he was talking about how his first agent was recommending to get rid of the accent. Or Tony Hellerman's 40 rejections before he got published.
Mhm.
Fabulous writing, Tony. Just get rid of the Indian stuff.
Yeah.
And so you have to be your own guide in all of this. You have to trust your gut.
I think the relevant quote there might be from Duke Ellington: if it sounds good, it is good. If people are responding to it in a way that you can discern as a reliable index, it's good, to that cohort.
Well, I want to stay right there, Mike, because in pairing that with Joel, with what you were saying, it's about what you put out into the world. You have to be discerning in what you release. What is the process like for both of you? What is the gestation period? How do you know when something is ready to be released? What if there's something that you might not see the vision that you saw, or you might not see it as ready to be released? How do you know when something is ready, or how do you know that I'm not releasing something out there that isn't my best work?
Beta test it. If you can find some people that you trust and you understand their perspective, because you got to know who you're showing the work to. Everybody's going to have their own sensibility, right? If you show me street photography, it's not my forte, right? You might be better at taking it to Stephen Shore. But I would encourage you to get responses from a number of trusted sources that have a diversity of perspectives. And then also, I love having an open studio because it allows me to beta test the work and see how people are responding to it. I even throw myself into the fire and have artist talks every day. And I make a couple of statements. I throw it open for questions and see where people want to go. Because the questions they ask are as revealing as the responses, often something more.
Mm-hmm.
So, seek feedback.
Excellent advice.
Yeah, I can pass that back to you, Derek, because you might be the most Instagram enabled, or at least the ropes, perhaps better than myself, at least. I can speak to that. Let's just quickly talk about Instagram is a worldwide audience, but are there ways in which that audience is too big for a quote beta test, and you do need to sort of narrow it down to something of a group of people who are just more perhaps selected for?
Yeah, I want to hear John Paul, because this kind of goes back to what you were saying with finding the right audience for that beta test. And, is it the same trusted beta group? Is it different depending on what the vision is? How important is it the opinions or perceptions of the layperson versus the expert, or versus even somebody who knows you? If you have somebody who has intimate knowledge of your work, John Paul, and how you see the world, does that person's opinion weigh heavier than the masses, the Instagram followers, the people who are out there who don't know you as intimately?
The questions you're asking are ways to evaluate the kind of feedback that you're getting. You need that kind of insight to be able to put it in context and perspective. Then you're going to weight it differently depending on what your objective is. If your objective is to reach a mass audience, then you're going to weight certain kinds of things more heavily. If you're talking about something that's fairly rarefied, you got to acknowledge that there's going to be a limited audience for that. It's only going to be interesting to certain people, and that's okay. Now we're talking about Seth Godin's tribes. All you really need is a tribe of 1,000 that are really active and engaged. I don't find that social networks are a great place to get substantial feedback. I used to tease when Flickr was around and call it Flickr love, and I think you have to invite certain kinds of responses. If you want an emotional response, ask, hey, how does this make you feel? Even then, people don't always read that and they just sort of fire off, or they just give you a heart, and that matters. That's nice. But it's not the kind of substantial conversation I can have with one of my favorite people to share work with is Sean Kernan, who's a writer and an actor and a brilliant photographer. And he just comes at things from such a Zen Buddhist perspective that I know he's always going to give me something outside of the box. He's certainly not the only person I'm going to share it with, but I can always rely on him for an unconventional and uncensored, not a polite response, but a very articulate response. And it's rare to have friends like that. And if you can find those relationships, cultivate them. They're treasures.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to mention one thing about how do I know when I've finished the editing process? I mean, the editing is so critical to making a rock formation image into a work of art. You know, when you're out in the field taking pictures, these are uncurated captures before they're even images. And then it's the responsibility of the photographer to turn them into images and turn them into artworks. And the question is, how far do I go with the editing? I don't want to betray the original formation. I'm not using AI, of course. It should be what the original formation is saying, but nature does not provide exactly the right lighting and certainly not the right emphasis, and the sun is moving all the time. And in fact, in this psychogeological photography, it's not always crucial to have golden hour light. You can do it in direct sunlight, and they're pretty much all going to be in black and white. But I notice I have a gut feeling when I reach a certain point in the editing. And that's the first sign to me that I have something. And then I think what John Paul just said is hugely valuable about finding reliable people. Instagram is very hit and miss. On the other hand, in the series I call the Anthropocene Ruins, there's one particular photograph that I didn't think was the most interesting or the best, and it won a few contests. So I thought, there must be something. I mean, it's one of my best, but it's not the best. It's not my favorite.
Right.
Yeah, I really want to celebrate what Joel is saying there is trust your gut. And one of the things I absolutely adore about digital tools is I always say you never know where the line is until you step over it. So I deliberately try and push it too far and say, okay, this porridge is too hot. This porridge is too cold. Somewhere in here is just right. Always using that body, that gut, that emotion, that heart as a kind of a live wire to evaluate whether you're still in flow.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Wow, now we are really getting into the deep expanses of the mind right there, which is probably a good time to take a break. So let's stand up, stretch, shake it out, or if you're already standing, have a seat, relax. And when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Joel Simpson and John Paul Caponigro.
Samsung's latest flash technology invites you to rev up your laptop, desktop computer, or even your PlayStation with blazing speed. The latest turbocharged 4TB 9100 Pro internal SSD tackles large files, high-resolution video projects, and high frame-rate gaming applications with virtually no lag or limitations. It has a standard M.2 2280 form factor and a PCIe 5 NVMe 2.0 interface for massive read speeds of up to 14,800 megabytes per second and write speeds of up to 13,400 megabytes per second, twice the speed of the 990 Pro. And if you're using the 9100 Pro in cramped quarters, like in a PlayStation 5, it's also available with an optional heatsink. Head on over to bnh.com to find out how to turbocharge your workflows with Samsung SSDs or visit the link in our show notes.
And we are back with Joel Simpson and John Paul Caponigro. Now, before the break, we took you on a trip. We went out into the world of psychology and philosophy. I want to go back to what we were talking about just before we broke. Now, Joel, you were talking about your post-processing. John Paul, I want to bring you in on this conversation and talking specifically about what your process is for taking what you've created in camera. Now, you were talking about the benefits of technology and digital technology in particular. Can you talk about your process or post-process as it relates specifically to all the technology that we have our hands on now?
It is such a generalized question. It's hard to know where exactly to jump in. And, while certain workflows have been outlined, I think everybody has multiple workflows, and we should challenge those workflows. So when I do something crazy like put a new layer on a Photoshop file to figure out how I want to dodge and burn it and make a dodge and burn map, doesn't look that different from a grease pencil that Ansel might have used, right? but it's a very useful visual guide. I find myself constantly copying files and making multiple iterations, whether that's, let's say, on a straight photograph. Straight. Okay, let's just go with it. Making multiple virtual copies and pushing it around. What's it look like in black and white? What's it look in color? Which color? Like the idealized color palette where you strip out any color cast, or synthetic color where you change the color into something entirely different from what it was on the scene. I use these tools as a laboratory to make a lot of different experiments. And I try and avoid having just one way of doing things and always coming up with the same results. You know the definition of insanity, right? It's using digital tools. No, sorry. So I would highlight, first and foremost, don't get stuck in a rut. Realize when your groove becomes a rut.
That's a good one. Pocketing that coinage.
Now I got to figure out how. How do we do that? I mean, it's almost putting a boundary on it.
Yeah. Well, right. Okay. So let me give you one other tool. And I remember when I shared this with Jeff Shiwi 20 some odd years ago at a Canon Explorer dinner. We were just getting to know each other. And he asked me a similar question. How do you know what to do with your images? I remember also speaking to a pre-press guy who was very conversant in all this. He says, I know how to do this. I just don't know what to do. Which is a really interesting challenge. You could spend your entire life learning all the technique and never develop. I like to emphasize a point of view, which is very different than an angle of view. How do we develop that point of view? I think of every exposure that I make as having a conversation with the subject and myself. I think of every move that I make in Photoshop as having a conversation with the image that started one way and is developing in another. I ask, what does the image want? How is this image working? How are the elements within it relating to one another? I literally strike up a conversation in my mind between the elements. And then don't forget to include yourself, like include myself in this. How am I responding? That kind of gut feeling that Joel was celebrating there. I consider it a conversation, start a conversation. If you have a rich conversation, it's likely that you're going to have a rich conversation with your viewers, and maybe they're going to have rich conversations with each other that your imagery started.
Can I give you an example of a discovery that I recently made that surprised me? I went to China in May in search of geological marvels, and incontestably the most marvelous place I went to had those 3,000-foot towers of quartz sandstone that had inspired the floating mountains of the movie Avatar. It's a place called Zhangjiajie.
Right.
And you take a shuttle bus, then a cable car, and you go up to the 3,000 feet. So you're at the level of the tops. And it was an overcast but clear day. It didn't have the typical clouds that are often put in the landscapes. And I took loads of photographs and drone photographs. And I came back, and I love my landscapes there. But I thought, well, what is there that goes beyond landscape? And I said, well, wait a second, what's really going on? Well, the towers that were closest to the observation point were well-defined. And understand that there's vegetation all the way up. It's like there's a little tiny forest on the top and then pieces of forest down the rock. So you have both the geological formations and the vegetal formations. And this is extremely familiar, but always seductive. And I realized that I could take one tower, the top of this one tower, and the background was already a little hazy, but I could separate those two, take out the color entirely in order to just show the forms, which are so beautiful in trees, and lighten the background. So I'm exaggerating the fact that it's background. And then in the foreground, even increase the contrast in black and white. And I have this vertical. And all of a sudden, it's the same stuff as everyone else is seeing, but it's showing you the details of the forms so clearly that it becomes a compelling photograph that I'd never seen before. A tower in high contrast black and white against a very low contrast background. And it works. And it's just something that I tried kind of on a dare to myself. How am I going to represent this in black and white? And how is it going to be different from every other photograph of this amazing place that I had seen? There's even a photographer who lives up there. And we made a great connection, even though I didn't speak Chinese and he didn't speak English. And all of his photographs are large, broad format landscapes, and they're all with clouds, with snow, at sunsets, and they're very conventional landscapes and totally beautiful. But I was there on a day where there were no clouds. And obviously it's the towers piercing through the clouds that are so interesting. No clouds, so I could see the towers all the way down. And I got images that were completely different than the ones in his books. And then this black and white thing is totally different.
Yeah, and I would suggest that we're also getting your relationship in the images as well, because anyone can just sit there and wait for a clear day. Anyone can learn atmospheric perspective and learn the tools. You can more clearly render the stuff that's out there, but you can't become another person and adopt their perspective. It's that layering of experience and that particular point of view that I think gets into our photographs that makes them really special.
I would say, John Paul, yeah, that statement, you can't become another person, is perhaps relevant and actually true for like today, August 2025. But with the onslaught of this generative AI technology, that is becoming like an actual destination, perhaps. Not necessarily becoming another person, but using these tools if you have sufficient sort of knowledge and wisdom about them. And I've seen this happen with people who take months to create their final image using generative AI tools, that they're sort of discovering as they go, because it is sort of like a slot machine, as you generate new stuff. It can drift quite far from where you perhaps started as an artist. Anyway, that's just a stupid way to get to this next segment, which is just like, let's perhaps touch on these new technologies.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please save me, yeah.
Well, let me suggest that that's been going on, particularly with photography, for far longer than AI has been around.
Okay.
There's a cult of zonies who have followed Ansel's tripod marks, who have learned the zone system and learned to replicate that look. None of them are Ansel. They were not inspired by the transcendental writers like Thoreau and Emerson to walk physically the range of light and have these transcendent experiences. He had a passion and an experience, and it gets into his work. Keith Carter years ago said in one of his wonderful evening slideshow, I believe it was Santa Fe workshops, the world doesn't need another Ansel Adams. We already had one. What the world needs is you. Never had another one of you. So if we can lean into our own personal experiences, our own life, if we can enrich that life, it's going to get into the work.
Yes, absolutely. And I take your point. And I love the group that's called Zonies, and I want to join them because I often find myself just saying that word out loud for some reason, but now I know why.
Their craft is awesome, and they have good adventures, and they have camaraderie.
Correct.
Now, if you want authenticity, if you want Joel's originality, you need to go a little further, right? But to your point, back to AI. Where do you want to go with AI? Because it's a bombshell, isn't it?
Each person's originality.
Yes, correct, Joel.
Yeah.
So I don't know where I want to go with AI.
The mind is the original AI. You can dive into the mind, and when you open your mind, you can create with pointed accuracy exactly what you want rather than type 37,000 prompts in to try to not have a third arm on someone.
I agree, Timothy Leary. Can I get some of what you've just dropped?
Yeah, because the third arm,
The third arm. We all love that sixth finger on the hand. But no, I mean, when you can open your mind up, back to this idea of boundaries and parameters, and do I feel like I have to harness my work in, or am I going to let it run free? And I think it opens up a much larger discussion of finding yourself and this idea of identity as a person, as an artist, as a creative, as a visionary. And we put up our own walls. Mind you, some people have the capacity to go way further, and some people have a way different vision, but we create our own boundaries.
Yeah. Derek, I think that point is a good way to perhaps sharpen the Inquisition here.
Let's not.
We're so in the weeds.
Could I just inject the notion of chaos here and what a rich source it is? Because AI is anti-chaos. AI is the sum and quotient of everything that's gone before, that's been established, that's been seen. And most people have a hard enough time getting to that level. But when you're out in the wilderness among rock formations, you're seeing things that are products of natural forces, not human minds, which AI is only drawing from the products of human minds. So chaos becomes an enormously rich source. So that you can, and I keep stressing this, collaborate with the chaos. The chaos touches off things in your mind, and you're not going to find identical images in the chaos that you have in your mind. You're going to find variations that your mental images help you identify. But then what the final product of this collaboration with the chaos is something no one has ever seen before, way beyond the capacities of AI.
Right.
Okay, now I could cite Finnegan's Wake too, but
quite
example.
literally, as AI was explained to us by Boris Elginson, it is sort of the inversion of chaos. There's a latent space of absolute chaos, and it gradually prunes the chaos.
It's a recombination of pre-existing elements.
Yeah.
Whereas chaos is not. It's just the product of natural forces.
Correct.
Well,
Now you can make a philosophical connection there if you want.
I'm not going to. But look, we just jotted down AI in this form.
Sure.
Perhaps it's not a relevant subject for this discussion.
You have to ask that question. It's on everyone's mind. How far can I go with AI?
I guess that's where it comes up.
I'd love to weigh in here.
Yeah, what do you have?
I think we could easily get into prejudicial statements about a new tool which is in the process of changing everybody's lives. It's here to stay, and it will evolve so fast. It already has, and it will continue to, that we're going to have a hard time keeping up with those changes. Our language has still not caught up to Photoshop. We have very few words for photography. You can even boil it down to one. Now, writers don't have the same assumption. Where is the fiction section in the photography section?
It's my last chapter.
Yeah, right. It is. You include it, which is great. And you make those disclosures. I think AI images are fundamentally different. I think one of the problems we have is we don't clearly describe how those things are different and how that would change the philosophies behind what's being created. And so subsequently how we would use them and when and where it would be appropriate and where it would not be. It's not okay to put deep fakes into even social media channels unless you disclose that they're deep fakes. Like, this is just a joke. But if somehow this stuff gets into CNN and we take this stuff as, quote, fact, put big quotes around fact, right? Then, Houston, we have a problem. I think we need to have a really rich discussion about how AI changes the nature of representational images. And we are lacking in the language to make these distinctions, but we need to develop it if we're going to be a free society and if we're going to be well-informed. I think AI is going to do some pretty wonderful things. And I think already there have been some really interesting uses. My wife is exploring some of this in order to render images that she doesn't have photographs for of memories. Right? Or maybe try and make an image that would be the memory of her mother. Right? So when we get into experiences as deep and as personal as memories, we're in an interesting territory. It's not just the rather aimless cartography of photography. It's a whole other thing. I'm looking forward to when AI starts to out AI.
Unpack that statement for us.
I want my iPhone to tell me what I'm looking at. I want it to tell me this is an AI-generated image or this is 50% AI-generated. I want that to be built into the system so that these kinds of disclosures are made automatically. If I'm looking at a Gaza victim and it's coming off Adobe stock and it's AI-generated, I want that to be part of the image. I don't want that to be hidden when it's later shared.
Yes, yeah.
Right?
Of course.
Like, better information. It's really important for at least in documentary, in historical, in the media, in uses for photography like that, where we're trying to get the facts, ma'am, even though we know it's quite challenging. And I would direct everyone to the Guardian's 1980 commercial called Points of View. It's a brilliant lesson in media and how we read it. Look at it. It's fabulous. We need these continual disclosures all the time. I think one of the best things that CNN did during Arab Spring is they said, hey, we don't have any journalists on the ground right now. There's a real difference between amateur journalists, like citizen journalists, and a professional journalist. And here's what the professional journalist does. And these folks are not. But this is the only footage we have. It was very responsible of them to say, this is what you're looking at. We need that on a daily basis, not just assume that because it looks like a photograph, it's true. What do you mean true? We have to understand what we've been looking at all along has been interpreted. And we need disclosures as to what the author is trying to do. And there needs to be accepted practices within those media outlets particularly. And when you get into a fine art situation, you need to not make those assumptions. And when it's relevant, artists need to make disclosures and saying, hey, at the very least, this is fiction, this is nonfiction, or I do use some of it. You know, when people come into my exhibits, they assume that I've done a lot of stuff with Photoshop. And then sometimes they'll run into one and say, it doesn't look like you did anything here. Well, actually, it's 4 exposures. Really? And they say, how did you alter this landscape over here? I say, well, actually, it's straight. No way, that doesn't look real. And these are the very things that we need to expose ourselves for so that we become A, canny, and B, comfortable with uncertainty.
Of course, it all depends on what people's expectations are, whether it's photojournalism, reportage, whether it's an impressive landscape showing you the way a place really is. Just very briefly, in my book, I made a discovery that you could actually classify the different missions of photography the same way we classify grammatical sentences. The indicative shows you what's out there, and we expect it to be authentic. The imperative tries to sell you something. The subjunctive is a fantasy, possibly created by some kind of multi-image combination. And the interrogative is, do you see what I see? Which is what I'm doing. The last image in my book is a question mark that I found in nature, a real question mark. Do you see what I see?
Yeah.
But also, I want to put in a little boost for the role of imagination in photography. We're not talking about journalism here. We're not talking about showing what's out there. But we're talking about how we can use what we find out there for imaginative purposes, aside from the place where the thing took place. For example, my last chapters, I briefly mentioned about fiction. All of those images are fisheye images, which imply a certain distortion or creation of a virtual convexity of real geological subjects, whether it's the walls of caves or dried mud pond. But then I recontextualize some of them by putting a starry sky in back of it, and I call it an imaginary asteroid. And in other cases, I call it the Anthropocene war ruins 500 years in the future. But this is an exercise of imagination, but I'm not combining images except for the starry sky business. Everything actually was really out there. I'm just repurposing it and recontextualizing it. So I'm allowing my imagination to have some play and inviting the viewer to use his or her imagination in appreciating this. And I don't think that people realize, it's a huge statement, the imaginative possibilities that photography, capturing reality, and Lyle Rexer reminds us, calling it the facticity of photography, which is not the factuality. The facticity, in other words, photography captures what's actually out there. But then how you interpret it, what context you put it in, can range very widely and include the imaginative.
I just want to celebrate what Joel said there. Yes, imagination. If Einstein says imagination is more important than information,
that's right.
You're onto something.
A far-reaching sense of wonder. And it sounds like you both have this constant yearning for what else is out there. And just in listening to you guys talk, it's diving me back in. It's like everything from philosophy to psychology to transcendentalism. It's taking me back to my college literary days and really just tapping into the mind. And again, this idea of wonder, this concept of wanting to find what hasn't been found, wanting to tap the well that hasn't been tapped. How much does that play into the work that you are both creating?
Well, it's not a matter of intention. It's a matter of surprise at result. My greatest satisfaction that I get from my viewer's reaction is when people say, now when I go outside, whether it's to a park or to a wilderness, I'm seeing much more and I'm relating to it at a deeper level from my own feelings and mind and spirit. My God, if photography can do that, it's as powerful as any other art, as Beethoven, right? As Joyce, as Flaubert. I mean, all of the arts are media. They're media between mind and reality. And we can raise photography to that level when we bring all of these elements of ourselves, of the craft, of the history, and of the chaos out there into our work.
Wow.
Yeah, listening to you and this discussion, I'm reminded of a moment when I was on stage at Photoshop World with Joe McNally and Jay Maisel. Joe shows a brilliant portfolio, and he starts out, if you want to make more interesting photographs, go to more interesting places.
Yeah, right.
And so Jay starts out his visual diary, as usual, really always wonderful insights into seeing. He starts out, if you want to make more interesting pictures, be more interesting. And I think this applies to AI too. It doesn't matter whether it's a paintbrush, AI, photography, words on the page.
Yeah.
Bring that. I just want to celebrate the whole sense of wonder. In that sense of wonder, there's a sense of gratitude, of appreciation, of hunger, of wanting to reach out to the world, perhaps into ourselves, realize that the world and we, not so different. In fact, we're part and parcel. We're the same. We're just an extension of it. So I would say expanding wonder is the reason I'm in this. It's my primary mission. I remember when I was first introduced to Photoshop, I thought it was like a microscope or a telescope, or in this case, it was a mind scope. Right? There's so many ways to approach this. I think we couldn't do better than Joseph Campbell's advice, follow your bliss.
Wow. This conversation has come full circle where we started, Joel, with your travels out to the West, me being a Jersey boy, and really finding my photography out West with the formations of the Southwest. And I just love the geography of that area. But it leads us back to something you just touched upon, John Paul, about place, the sense of place. And I'm interested in the places that you both have been, that you draw inspiration from, because yes, this sense of wonder is and mystery is amazing, and it's great for this hope and for creativity. But a lot of inspiration we also draw from the places we've been, our experiences in the past. What places take you back to a place of inspiration? You guys have been all over the world. Is there any place that jumps out for each of you that takes you back to something that was just transcendental in the way you think and the way you see and the way you create work?
Well, I have a whole list of sites on page 193. These places have been so enriching. Of course, the national parks, but also the state parks, which don't have giant vistas, but have wonderful trails. Red Rock Canyon State Park in Nevada is wonderful, and Goblin Valley State Park in Utah. This is not Goblin Colony. But also the places that are not state parks, that are Bureau of Land Management land. Bistai Badlands, I've been to many times, and then nearby Asli Shepa. Also in Utah, this place Fantasy Canyon, which is near Dinosaur National Monument. It's not where the 5 national parks are in the south. It's in the northeast corner of Utah. It's amazing. It's not huge, but the erosion has created just a short forest of amazing formations, many of which are figurative. And then this other place, Little Finland, which took 3 hours at 15 miles an hour after the asphalt ended through mud and sand to get to a place you had to spend overnight. It's a little difficult to get there, but oh my God. And by the way, I have scenic photos at the back of the book that show you what these places look like in color and where they are on a little map. And when I can find one of these outside of a guidebook, Martres, M-A-R-T-E-R-E-S, has a series photographing the Southwest. It's very, very helpful, especially for landscapes. And he tells me, well, it's not the kind of thing that you're looking for, but most people look for it. No, when he says photographic value and scenic value, he gives you a rating at the back. this is a way to find these places. I also recommend other places in the book, and how to read between the lines in guidebooks like rough guides. Oh, geologically interesting. Some people see blah, blah, blah. Okay, check it out on the web, and the web will tell you. Also, I discovered entirely by accident a place in Kazakhstan that I must visit. It's called Yubekty Canyon, Yybykty Canyon, in the Mengistu area. I got to go there.
You haven't been?
No, I want to
Okay.
go there this fall. I mean, I went to China. I saw these amazing places in China. I'll send my itinerary to anyone who wants it. This company, China International Travel Service, was brilliant. They gave me things I hadn't even heard of for 4 caves. I saw the terracotta warriors, which are not geological, but everyone must see them. And then this Yubekty Canyon in the Mengistu area, you can find tours there for $1,000, $1,300. You can get 8 days there that take you to 22 different places in Kazakhstan, all right? And don't neglect the Silk Road cities of Uzbekistan when you're out there. You go to Instagram and look up Yybykty, and you'll see an incredible drone sequence that's using obstacle avoidance to go through this very narrow canyon that is just loaded with formations, largely Tafoni. But it's someplace I got to go. So yes, you find interesting places. And Siskind didn't know about these, but they weren't even known in those days. I mean, the slot canyons of Page, Arizona were hardly known in those days.
John Paul, you made this distinction between places of interest and people of interest. But I can say that, Joel's list of amazing places is only interesting because of his own deep, sort of personally interesting...
You can say it, obsession. You can say it. Go ahead and say it, obsession.
but one begets the other. I mean, so it might be a distinction with some difference, but maybe not a lot of difference. John Paul, is there any sort of geographic location that resonates with you personally in a way that you find mystifying and sort of beguiling?
Well, I'd like to say land is like light. It's all interesting. And I love my backyard.
Yeah.
The bird song lifts my heart almost as much as my wife. It feeds me. I eat the sorrel. I eat the rose. I eat the apple. So it becomes a part of me. And I really deeply appreciate Japan, even the most urban areas like Tokyo and Kyoto, how deeply woven into nature they are, or how deeply they weave nature, and depending on your perspective. I travel to savor a variety of experiences land has to offer. I'm looking to have a conversation with a land that has been relatively untouched by man. And so I usually have to go pretty far afield. Man's interaction with land changes the conversation. Sometimes that's beautiful, as I've mentioned, particularly in sacred sites like in the British Isles. But the place that has changed my perspective and captivated me, I'll never escape it. It's become a part of me. It's become a part of my dreams, is Antarctica. It's like traveling to another planet, but it's home. And it touches every other part of the world with the 200-year current that weaves its way around the world. It changes climate. It's a profound mystery. The largest body of fresh water is a frozen desert.
Right.
It's called the Antarctic ice cap. This slumbering mystery, 2% of which you see, is so mercurial. It's absolutely fascinating. I could go on, and I have in 2 books of poetry. And I don't know how many, there's at least 2 portfolios developing. And of course, I have an exhibit, and you can see the exhibit's up on my website at johnpaulcaponigro.art. You can hear me talk about it. And yet, everything that I've shared so far just isn't enough because it's so captivating. And one of the things that has really resonated with all of that is even though it feels like another planet, it's home. Even though it feels so remote and was only recently discovered, it still touches all of us without us even knowing about it, seeing it, or perhaps visiting it. If you get a chance to go, it will change your perspective on what a wonderful planet we live on and how wonderful it is to be a part of it.
Well said, John Paul. Jill and Derek, you may want to weigh in on this, but dare I say, as well said as Jonas Perel has said on this podcast, Jonas Perel being a photographer of the Arctic, which in its emptiness, remoteness, and vastness is something he finds incredibly unique.
I'm making it a requirement. We need a poet on every episode now. I'm putting in a request because
I agree. Yes.
it just hits differently.
Oh, yes, it does.
It hits differently.
Ekphrastic writing is the democratic antidote to art speak. It's not a medium. It's not a genre. It's a revolution.
Amen.
All right.
Wow. On that note, John Paul, you did drop the website there. What do you have coming up in the works? What projects are you working on? Anything you're excited about? Exhibitions?
Several. Before my father passed last November, we were working on an exhibit, and we got it finished while he was around. We're updating the father and son exhibit that's been around a long time. Shannon Parrish from the Smithsonian was helping curate that, and it's now handled by Photographic Traveling Exhibitions. We're also now finally at the tail end of putting together a limited edition artist book, Conversations, published by Two Ponds Press, and that'll be released later this year. The theme is how music has influenced our images, and it will be this vinyl record. One side will be Dad's classical piano performances. On the other side, I'll be reading my poetry. I just so wish he were around to hold that vinyl record. It would make him so happy. We've had a trade book of a larger selection that's likely to come out sometime in the next 2 years. I put it off 2 years at this point. And I've got a number of solo projects in exhibits, books, and folios. I'm combining my images with creative nonfiction and poetry, including some of my writings that have currently been published in 83 journals, 17 countries, 5 continents. I'm finding that this synergy between text and image is really opening up new conversations and new dimensions in the work. And I've found that I've really needed to turn towards language because language is part of the problem. I hope it can be part of the solution. The problem that I'm addressing is when we see landscape, we usually refer to it with the pronoun it, objectifying it, and then it bounces back on us as a mirror. We objectify ourselves. Where is the pronoun? That is we, that includes the larger natural world. We need it. Raman Walkilmer proposes the Native American word key. Fine, any will do. Let's just start using that perspective.
Yeah.
Joel, what do you have in the works? Upcoming exhibitions, projects?
Well, I'm putting my China photographs together eventually for a new book. I'm very glad that I sent texts to my close friends describing my days and processes there, and that comes out to about 100 pages. And, of course, this next trip to Kazakhstan. Right now, though, I'm very engaged in promoting this book, Faces in the Rocks, since I opted for self-publishing. There's also a possibility of a major show in a European city, which I won't mention, but I have to come up with 15,000 euros, and I've applied for grants to do that. But people will know that if it happens, but I don't want to jump the gun.
I strongly recommend the book. I mean, the book is such an interesting perspective, Joel. It's a beautiful contribution. I really recommend people pick it up.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to you for writing that wonderful endorsement on the back. And it's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and I'm told 38 other print-on-demand places. Faces in the Rocks by Joel Simpson.
Wonderful. And I second that. A phenomenal book. And this was a fascinating conversation, to say the least. And I think it did what any fascinating conversation does. It opens up more questions in my mind than answers. And I think this is a conversation that yearns to be poked and prodded and explored, and take it for each viewer to take into your own mind and start asking yourselves these questions and go on your own journey of exploration. So I want to thank you both for opening up our minds.
Thank you, and thank you, listeners.
I certainly thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Could not agree more. That was a wonderful conversation, guys. Thank you so much.
And of course, a huge thank you to all of our listeners out there. If you are a fan of the show but are not yet a subscriber, please head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts, and kindly click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comment about the show. I'm your host, Derek Fosbender. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of us all, thank you so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Samsung for sponsoring this week's episode.